the mayor, the deputy mayor, has unfortunately to leave. I'm now inviting Professor David Gray to give his hands-on experience over a period of decades in water diplomacy and water and peace. Professor Gray was for decades the senior advisor of the World Bank in water policies development, and he is presently a visiting professor at Oxford University. Please, David.
Thank you very much indeed, Henk. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me just say that I first met Henk van Schaik in 1979. What's that? That's 24 years ago. 34 years ago. In Malawi, we were both young water specialists, and we were competing. Henk was working on gravity pipe schemes, and I was working on groundwater sources and wells, which were, of course, much better than his pipe schemes. We should pause for a moment as we watch images of the Philippines right now, when we see what wind and water can do, and can do in ways that we cannot possibly imagine. This is the third Category 5 storm that the Philippines has seen in the last 3 years. And closer. Okay. This is the third Category 5 storm that the Philippines have seen in the last 5 years. Sorry, in the last 3 years. And these are 100-year events. They're not supposed to happen for 100 years. So stationarity is dead. We cannot use the past as a guide to the future. And we need to reflect and do our best for those that suffered and are suffering today in the Philippines. I'm delighted to be here in the Netherlands. Over my 40 years of working on water, I've been here many, many times, and I've worked with Dutch experts all over the world. And it's obvious why. This country on the Rhine Delta that lives on the front line between the land and water, a third of the nation below sea level. The Rhine shared by 9 countries, 6 along its main stem. I understand that the first agreement on the Rhine was a unilateral declaration by Charlemagne in the year 805. So 1,200 years ago, the first treaty that we know of on water. And since then, about 500 agreements on this river. David Lamarckand in 1977 described the Rhine as the sewer of Europe. And in 1987, an effort by the Rhine countries under the Rhine Action Plan to clean up the river, and by 2000, a clean Rhine. There are many lessons that we can all learn from the Rhine, both negative and positive. I'm a practitioner. I'm a fake academic. Much is written about the science-policy divide. It's said that scientists don't practice and policymakers don't read. I'm learning to read. I've worked in the last 40 years on close on 100 countries in the last 40 years on water. I'm going to tell some stories and draw some conclusions. And Henk told me to keep this informal, to take my jacket off, which I haven't done, and not to use PowerPoint slides. Well, I have 3 or 4 images for you only. Let me start by saying that we live in a divided world. This is something that's puzzled me in my years of practice. There's something happening that took me a long time to understand. Water is both productive and destructive. So water security, unlike food and energy security, has 2 sides to that coin. It's not just about secure access. This Chinese saying, not only can water float a boat, it can sink it also. So this idea that water can both hurt you and it can help you. Nature can help you and it can hurt you. Over half of the world's population today are not water secure and are maladapted now. We define water security as tolerable water-related risks to society. These people face intolerable risks of unpredictable water shocks, intolerable risks of poor supplies, inadequate water supply, sanitation, access to water for nutrition, and so on. And I've asked myself, I lived in Africa for 14 years, lived in Asia for many years. I said, why is there a problem? I mean, Africa, the rainfall in Africa, the average rainfall is 700 millimeters. The average rainfall in Europe is 700 millimeters. So what's the problem? I mean, the difference is that in my country, it rains almost every day. And in Africa, when the rain comes, it comes heavy and it comes short. So one rain or two short rains, sometimes those rains fail altogether. Sometimes twice as much comes. And we began to puzzle over the issue of variability and complexity, hydrological complexity. I'm going to show you one difficult graphic. So bear with me as I do this. I beg your pardon. Yeah, slides are confused. I will go back to the other slide. Risk equals hazard plus vulnerability. This has come off my Mac, so it looks a little bit distorted, but hopefully it will work. So on the x-axis, hazard, and on the y-axis, vulnerability. So hydrological complexity is the hazard, and investments in information, institutions, and infrastructure on this axis. And here we have a lot of colored plots. These are river basins across the world, and this is the first set that we've done. The red river basins are the poorest in the world. These are World Bank classifications on income. So the poorest river basins are in red, the next are in yellow, the next are in blue, and the richest are in green. So when we look at this, we can see 4 quadrants, perhaps. Down in the bottom right, deeply water insecure river basins, and these are the poorest basins in the world, some of them very large. Top right, water secure but very vulnerable, frail water security. Top left, very low hazard, low vulnerability, lots of investment, and rich. And bottom right, countries that are water secure but haven't invested too much and probably have a fairly high tolerability for risk. And we look at these risk lines, and you can see that above the top line, there are only green countries, only rich countries have invested that amount to become water secure. And we look at pathways. The further across you are to the right, the more you have to invest to become water secure. So the harder it is to get there. The greater the complexity, the higher the cost, the longer the time, the harder it is to do. So when we place the poorest river basins in the world, they all sit in the bottom right-hand corner. There's something in this story. We live in a divided world. So countries down in the bottom right need to invest more in information, institutions, and in infrastructure. They invest much less. In Africa, we find about 5% of the density of hydrometric networks than we have in Europe in the richest countries in Africa, a tiny proportion. So information is missing, even though you probably need 10 times more met stations, river gauging stations. We find weaker institutions, lower capacity, fewer PhDs, fewer graduates working in this subject, and we find much less infrastructure than a tiny fraction, 2 or 3% of the infrastructure that rich countries have to manage a much simpler water challenge. So I want to leave you with this thought. We cannot just universalize across the world. When we look at the world of water, we must understand that many of the poorest countries in the world have an endowment of extremely complex hydrology. And when we look at these river basins, and in particular the international ones, they are characterized by poor information, poor institutions, and poor infrastructure. And when you have little information, there is a risk that you have misperceptions about what's going on, and misperceptions become fears, and fears influence international relations and often can destabilize international relations. And what we find in river basins, what I found in many of the basins in which I work, and that is that there are massive misperceptions because of the absence of knowledge, and those misperceptions destabilize relationships, and perceptions matter. I want to emphasize again and again, perceptions matter. And I'm going to go back up to this graphic. This is a graphic that shows, well, it almost shows a football, a nice circle of squares in the middle. Does anybody see that this is actually straight lines? There's nothing but squares on this graphic, nothing but squares. There is no circle. Every single line on this is straight. So even though you think you're seeing something, you can be wrong. You can be wrong. David Lamarckand also said, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Secretary of State, United States, said that everyone can have opinions, their own opinions, but no one can have their own facts. There's only one set of facts. You can have your opinions on this picture, but the facts are these are all straight lines. Just finishing up with this slide, in the bottom right, this is the threat. This part of the world is where water diplomacy is most needed, where investment is needed, where support is needed. And as we populate this, there are probably a third of the world's population live in countries that have river basins that sit in this quadrant. Africa and the Nile. Let me just, a few words. Africa, 60 international rivers in Africa, lines drawn on maps in London and Paris and Lisbon and Berlin and Rome in the 19th and early 20th century that took no account of anything, of geography, of culture, of religion, of language, and certainly not of hydrology. More countries per river basin, more river basins per country. Guinea and upstream riparian on 13 international rivers. Mozambique, a downstream riparian on 9 international rivers. It's really hard to manage one river with your neighbors. Look at the Rhine. But imagine having to manage 13. It transpires that the poorest countries in Africa actually have the most river basins. So again, these strange, what's the causality here? Are they poor because of this, or is it because of this that they cannot manage these, because they're poor that they cannot manage these rivers? A few words about the Nile. I'm going to tell some stories of a few river basins quickly and then move on to some generic lessons. The Nile, the longest river in the world, an extraordinary river, but extremely low flows, just a tiny fraction. 6% of the Congo, 17% of the Niger, 25% of the Zambezi, so not much water. Very long histories, as we all know. So millennial stories where the fellahin, the farmers in the Egyptian desert, and down in the delta, believed that when there were droughts or floods, it was because of people up in the mountains who were blocking the river. And the people in the mountains believed, and still believe, that the number of feast days they have, where it is a mortal sin if they work, the number of feast days is a consequence of the Coptic Church in Alexandria since 333, since that year, enforcing prayer on days so farmers would not use waters of the Nile. So beliefs, perceptions, misperceptions perhaps. Extremely variable, so a very complex river system. Lots of press recently, lots of news coming from the highest level. I was involved with many other people in supporting engagement over a dozen years. I've spent a lot of time in the basin, met most of the leaders over those years. Before this latest period of engagement began about 15, 18 years ago, and nothing flowed between upstream and downstream. Nothing much flowed. No labor, no telecoms, no roads, no railways, no power. Nothing much but arms, refugees, and water. And the attempt by all of the countries now, there's a constituency of people. There's lots and lots of people from the river basin countries, many of them trained in the Netherlands, by the way, who are working hard to try and turn around millennia of problems to bring cooperation. The press doesn't help. Much of the media talk about water wars and water wars on the Nile. Recently, there's been quite a lot of dialogue at the highest level. The Egyptian Prime Minister speaking just a few days ago, so Hazem al-Bablawi, on the 29th of October, speaking specifically about the a dam that the Ethiopians are planning to build on the border, having benefits for everybody, including for Egypt. But the following week, a meeting of water ministers last week in Khartoum, the reports from that was it was a fairly typical meeting between Egypt and Ethiopia, with Sudan as well, where there was disagreement on the detail. But I'm optimistic. When I'm asked, what do I think is going to happen on the Nile, I think there are so many people talking at the highest level that they will find a solution. The only way you can find a solution is to talk, and the only way you can find a robust solution is to argue. So I'm optimistic. I could talk for hours about the Nile, but let me move on to Asia. To this great third pole, the Himalayas, major river systems from the Yellow up in the northeast to the Yangtze, to the Mekong, to the Irrawaddy, to the Salween, to the Brahmaputra, part of the Ganges, Brahmaputra, Meghna, the Ganges itself, the Indus, the Amu Darya, the Siddhari as you swing round into Central Asia. Once again, the southern rivers are all monsoonal, extremely flashy, so very, very high levels of variability, very little shared understanding, very little cooperation, weak institutions. Cyril Radcliffe, a civil servant in London, spent 5 weeks in July and August of 1947, and he drew the border between a future West Pakistan and India and a future East Pakistan and India, now Bangladesh. He didn't like the heat, so he wanted to leave quickly, and he wanted to get out of the country before independence in mid-August. But he left behind lines that divided the Indus, all of the five, the Ravi, the Ravi, the Beas, the Sutlej, the Chenab, the Jhelum, the Indus, on the left-hand side, and the Ganges, in ways that would create problems for those countries forever. However, the Indus Treaty of 1960 has been robust. It has held up. I spent my childhood in India. My father was born in India. I spent my childhood in Pakistan. And I know the country pretty well. I lived in India for 4 years until 2009. The 2010 monsoon in Pakistan, Pakistan's worst recorded flood. 2,000 people killed, 1.7 million homes destroyed, 20 million people seriously affected, 20% of Pakistan underwater. That's the size of the UK. And a $20 billion economic loss. So massive shock in Pakistan. Government didn't do a particularly good job in responding and providing social services. Religious groups did, which didn't help the internal political situation. In 2011, the monsoon returned. Another 9 million people affected. A year later, 300,000 people in camps. Much speculation about political spillovers into terrorist activity. It's speculation. Constant media noise right now. There are two disputes. One before the court in this institute, the Permanent Court of Arbitration, the Kishinganga dispute, with an interim ruling earlier this year. So the World Bank, the third signatory to the treaty between India and Pakistan on the Indus was the World Bank. But again, there's dialogue. I mean, that treaty has held. The countries obey the rules to the letter. Just a quick word. I'm in and out of China quite a lot at the moment. China shares 111 rivers and lakes with 17 neighboring countries and has very few agreements with any of them on any of those. But China now is rethinking, rebranding. China's mostly upstream. China voted against the UN Convention in 1997. China's interpretation of the UN Convention was that it was biased towards upstream nations because of the no-harm rule, and I'm going to speak about that in a moment. In the Middle East, I chaired one of the opening sessions of the first Israeli-Palestinian conference on water in Zurich in 1992. That's dialogue. There was a second conference a number of years later, and that dialogue continues. That was in December 1992 in Zurich. And it was a prelude to some extent to the Oslo Accords. But following that, a young Palestinian team was put together called the Palestinian Task Force for Water, and became a foundation to some extent for the Palestinian Water Authority. I also work on the Tigris and Euphrates right now, so I'm in and out of Baghdad. I've been there several times this year. It's about as hard as it gets. I've never worked on a river where the situation is quite so existential. All rural livelihoods on the Euphrates are going, and that's not because of water quantity, it's because of water quality. So the risk of spending trillions on a war, and losing the peace because of water, that risk exists, but there are solutions. There are solutions. I'm an optimist. I wouldn't do what I did if I was not an optimist. What have we learned from experience? Why cooperate? Countries cooperate where the perception of benefits is greater than their perception of costs. We've seen this again and again and again. Cooperation on rivers is difficult. It's difficult for the reasons that Andra Solzhenitsyn mentioned a moment ago. First of all, water defies sovereignty. It ignores political and cultural boundaries. And strong institutions need political and cultural convergence to be capable and strong. And what we have on transboundary rivers is we have divergent, political and cultural divergence. Policymakers want certainty, which is complex with complex systems. Churchill said, "Give me a one-handed advisor," because I hate people coming into my office saying, "On the one hand, sir, but on the other hand." I want to say a quick word about the no harm rule, the global misunderstanding that harm travels upstream. And it travels upstream because of the foreclosure of future use. Even lawyers don't recognize that fact. I'm surprised how often that is not recognized. The normal assumption is that harm flows downstream. But as an international watercourse is developed by a downstream state, the scope for development upstream can shrink progressively. So the scope shrinks because if you use it first downstream, then when you use it later upstream, you cannot avoid causing harm to downstream. So everything hinges on information exchange from downstream to upstream and upstream to downstream, and dialogue before any development, up or down. 4 ideas on negotiating successfully. Institutions matter, and everything's about institutions. Communicate, 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 and listen. Regular meetings, clear procedures, align public communications, positive media messages, joint learning and exchange. Align interests, get behind positions to recognize interests. I want water rights, so I want food. I want poverty reduction. I want trade. I want peace. Negotiate a shared vision. Agree a journey destination. On the Rhine, it was Salmon 2000. It was a very simple idea. Salmon breeding above Mannheim again by the year 2000. A simple idea that everybody could understand. But shared visions on the Danube, on the Baltic Sea, on the Nile. A shared understanding of facts and perceptions. This is very difficult. And it's difficult partly because facts can confuse negotiations, and there's rent-seeking around facts. For the military establishment, the intelligence, often the foreign policy establishment, the water establishment, facts can damage your interests because budgets are increased when risks are perceived. Adopt clear rules. Adopt clear rules. Small rules of procedure, terribly important. For meetings, organizational rules of procedure. Medium rules, data and information sharing, notification and consultation, operating rules, environmental flows, much harder to do. Before you get to the big rules, and the big rules are water allocations and rights and costs and benefit shares, much harder to do, but helped greatly by the small rules and the medium rules. Learn and analyze together. Something we've done in several river basins is what we call cooperative regional assessments, where countries work together. They take the borders off the basin. They plan for the basin without borders. Excuse me. They plan for the basin without borders, and then they put the borders back on again. And they've looked at an optimum, what would happen if it was one country, and then they can negotiate around that optimum, recognizing the real political economy. So now let me end with a few key conclusions. There's only one blue planet. Neil Armstrong from the moon, when he looked back, he said, "I can see one blue planet." 0.1% of the water on this planet is fresh and liquid. and that's what we need to survive as a species. Water is not local anymore. Until the end of the 19th century, water was a local issue. Increasingly now, it's global. Water went from local to river basin, to nation, to beyond the nation, to international river basin, to global. Water is a flux. It moves from slow to fast. Water is not sovereign. A fundamental principle in international law is the principle of sovereignty. Water is not sovereign. It moves. It's a global asset. It's of importance to all of us as a species and to our planet. Water knowledge, for the first time in human history, is a global public good. We can get this without government data. Data can be kept secret, but river basins can be modeled and understood without public sector participation at the local level. And it's common to hear, even in discussions around early warning systems, that we'd love to participate, but our data is secret. You cannot even buy a topographic map of the Ganges today. Not even a topographic map, but we can get that from Google Earth. So 3 S's, sovereignty, secrecy, stationarity, are over. As we go into the future, this is a huge game changer for us. We must understand that it is of global importance that we understand the way water moves across this planet, and we understand what it means for peace and security and poverty reduction and health. Water wars or no wars, for me that's a rather ridiculous argument, because if you share a river basin with a neighbor, it's always going to influence your relationships, sometimes a little bit, like it does on the Rhine, and sometimes a lot, like it does on the Nile, but nobody goes to war over a single issue. Water insecurity is a threat to the planet. So exclusion, marginalization, migration, all of these things are the consequence of water insecurity, and 3 billion people plus are water insecure today. And water security, local to global, is essential for human welfare and political security. We need investment in the 3 Ins: infrastructure, institutions, and information, starting the other way around. Information first, institutions, and then infrastructure. And let me end with my final graphic. So river plus a dike for thousands of years in Chinese script is the symbol for political order and good governance. So you manage your river and you've got political order, and that message hasn't changed for us today. Thank you very much.